So it's really interesting. We've got representatives here from the Army, the Air Force, the Navy. If we have someone from the Coast Guard, Marine Corps in the audience, we've got a general staff here. I mean, that's great. So I want to thank all of you for being here, and I'm going to thank them again, but I particularly want to thank Peggy and Virginia for all of the work that they've done to get this together, because I really think we're going to have a fantastic dialogue. We've got all of these really smart, bright folks on the panel, some involved in education, some involved in actually managing people and managing people in businesses day to day, some involved in disseminating information. And I really want you to think about this. We're in this really hyper-connected era. We can get any information we want online. Basically, if I ask the right kind of empirical question and have the right kind of search engine, Google, I can get anything answered. Why do I even need an educational institution? So I want you all to think, and let me get some answers from you about that right now. Why do we need what you all do?
To make sense out of 100 million data points. Actually, the number of data points is 4 times 10 to the 19th power. Is the number of unique information generated in the year 2010, which is more than was generated in the previous 5,000 years. And so part of our task is to help learning shift from those of us who used to have a monopoly on information to those of us who hopefully will have significant contributions that can be made to society as to how to sort out that information. That's my first take.
And not only to sort out the information and to make sense of it, but to tell what is quality information that is empirical data and is what some guy somewhere thinks, which really has no basis in fact except his opinion. We tend to think in the internet world all opinions are equal, and they're not. Some are based on empirical fact, research, and study, and some are based on how somebody feels when they wake up in the morning. And the students need to be able to tell the difference.
So in other words, we're being consumed by a tsunami of junk.
Absolutely.
Potentially
at least, yeah.
Okay. Anyone else?
Well, someone has to administer all those tests to the kids. So it might as well be us, right? Exactly. You know, that video that we watched today, before I even came to Georgia from Maine, I actually sent that to the administrative team in Fayette County and asked them to take a look at it. Because one of the things I realized when I applied for this job, this was a very, very attractive position to apply for. I had done my homework on Fayette County. I knew that we had great business partnerships. I knew there was a lot of parental engagement. And I also knew that kids tested well. But to be honest with you, that wasn't a motivation for me to apply for this job in Fayette County. In fact, when I came down here last year and I started visiting schools, one of the things that really struck me was how laser-like focused our teachers, principals, even our parents and students were on test scores. And when I started looking at that, I started thinking, you know what, is that what we should be all about? I had read a book, The Global Achievement Gap by Tony Wagner, and many of the people in this room have heard me talk about Wagner's book. In fact, he's coming to Fayette County in April, and I'm really excited about that. But what I did after reading that book, I asked all of my leadership team, I asked the school board, and I've been asking civic groups when I go to speak, Rotary, Kiwanis, and I encourage them to read that book, because in Wagner's book, he talks about the survival skills we need for 21st century education, 21st century jobs. He interviewed CEOs from all over the world, and they identified the skills that kids need. And I wanted to change the conversation in Fayette County. We know that the newspapers, the television, the media, they judge us based on test scores. And I understand why teachers would be so focused on that, principals would be so focused, because that's how people determine if we're good or not good. But to me, that's not what it's all about. To me, it's about preparing kids for their future and talking about what skills kids need to be prepared for 21st century jobs. And I hope I have a chance to talk more in detail about that tonight. But I see the role of education as preparing kids for their future. And I love the quote that we have to prepare them for their future, not our past.
I think that's extremely relevant, Jeff, and I really appreciate you talking about that. I remember reading someplace somewhere that there's more information in an issue of People magazine than an 18th century person would have learned in their lifetime. So again, we're sort of in this exponential era where the information is just crunching down on us. And I think that you all have answered the question exactly. If we don't have, and I really want to be sure we emphasize this, if we don't have the institutions that you all lead, we're just going to be consumed by all of this junk out there. And if you can't do the critical thinking, if you can't do conceptual thinking, we're actually going to just be regurgitating junk. I remember reading a survey recently that said 30% of people surveyed across the nation believe that Saddam Hussein attacked us on 9/11. 20% of the people interviewed think that Alaska and Hawaii are not a part of the United States. And there's all of this information out there that you all talked about that's simply not true. And yet, because we see it online, we seem to think that it is. Jeff, you began to talk about, did anyone else want to just say anything?
Well, I just want to make a quick comment about the pace of the information growth. It has been estimated that information is growing so quickly that by the last 2 years of a 4-year education, the first 2 years information is obsolete. That by the time you graduate, half of what you learned is old information that is not technical information. That's right, technical information. Has been replaced by something else, or at least added to significantly. So it's not just quantity, but it's pace of increase as well.
Yeah, well, I just have to agree with that. When I was at UGA, I was studying for broadcast journalism, so we were learning on analog equipment, radio, TV, film. I was cutting and splicing, and it's like, this is great. And 2 years later, everything was on a computer, and oh, so everything I learned in that program was kind of out the door. So I think that is very accurate. The pace is something that we have to focus on, and I think even just at the newspaper, when I first started there, we were cutting things out on paper, pasting it up with wax, driving it down to a printing press. Now everything, again, is digital, so the industry itself changes so fast, and I think that's something that we have to wrap our minds around, is kind of imagining what might come next. That's something for students, I think, to be able to think about too, is free themselves from the constraints of thinking and outside the box and kind of almost finding a way to teach themselves.
Air Force guy down there, so he's really smart. Army, not so much, but definitely smarter than Navy.
Sleeping in a tent in the rain.
At least we can go home at night. So, when I was listening to your comments, one thing that struck me is that kids today there's so much immediate gratification that they all assume that they can be like Michael Dell and not have to graduate from any university and still be one of the top entrepreneurs and thinkers in the world, or Bill Gates. He didn't do it, why should I? They look at athletes today, and if you get a basketball player to last more than 1 or 2 seasons in college, that's the exception now. And so one of the things that institutions do for kids is that they ground them.
That's true.
I have a daughter who graduated from the University of Georgia a couple years ago. I have a son who's a freshman. And not only do they ground them, they expose them to a lot of different things that mom and dad couldn't do for them. And so my son's talking to me about stuff that I've never heard of, because my world is here, and so I can expose them things that I've been exposed to through my parents, but not the things that all these great educators are learning. So as the world is moving at the speed that it is, if we don't have grounded kids in institutions, they're going to go out into whatever form of society, and they're just going to get gobbled up because they have this internet version of what the world should be, and reality is not always the same, because like you said, a lot of these blogs are on there. Anybody can blog, but that doesn't mean that that's accurate information.
If I can tie one final thing on your question of why should we be in business, I believe our business is to create the conditions for citizenship, okay? So it is the American dream. An important part of citizenship is to be a part of the economic community. And so you are prepared to do a job. You are also prepared to adapt to the changes in the economic environment that our kids are going to be facing, and I think we'll get more to that as the conversation goes on. But beyond preparing students for a job, we also need to prepare them to interact effectively in a very diverse culture, right? The folks with whom we must interact are fundamentally different in the future than those that we've been allowed to be comfortable with interacting with in the past. And that's another obligation for citizenship. And finally, it seems to me that we must prepare students to accept responsibilities as being part of a community, right? That there is something more than having an obligation to oneself as being an educated citizen. And so I take that, I think we should take those duties really together, because it is easy to break those up into distinct parts and then to evaluate education based on their success or failure at any one of those parts. And I think that's unfair.
You know, all of you represent different aspects of education, different institutions. At one time, we were in an agrarian society. People sort of lived off of the land. Then we came into an industrial era where people were sort of working in factories, and now we're in this information era where we're knowledge workers, or things are constantly being sourced. I know I was talking to Randy a little earlier about the fact that we look at countries like the United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, and they have these technical training programs. They have apprenticeship programs. Does everybody have to go to college? What is the place of your various institutions? How are they relevant in terms of the life cycle of someone who's learning?
You just sort of hit on a bias, okay? So, which isn't hard, of course, for me. Randy and I were both at a presentation this afternoon that identified that a decision made in this country at the turn of the 20th century was an American commitment that everyone should have a high school diploma. Right. And European compatriots thought that was foolish. Why would you want to do that? Because these are things that American citizens won't need immediately. And while it was true that that goal was not required immediately, it set the foundation for industrialization that was capable for us in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. University presidents pushed back when the federal government suggested a GI Bill as something that we wouldn't know what to do with all these people, and they really don't need to go to college, right? And it has been singularly identified as the foundation to the greatest generation, that the folks coming back from World War II were allowed to go to college and become the leaders that all of us look back on and say, well, how did that happen? And so I guess I would take issue with the notion that not everybody has to go to college. I think there are opportunities in an emerging society, right, in which the 10 top jobs in 2010 did not exist in 2004, right? It seems to me that there may be a flip, right? There may very well be not the usual pattern of saying, well, you cannot go to college, so you'll go to technical education. I submit it may be more likely in the future that individuals will start with a 4-year baccalaureate degree and then will, through their careers, visit technical institutions to get specific emerging skills in an information age. I'm sorry, I get excited. What did he say? I mean, I really do think that if one looks historically in this country, the same sorts of comments were made 50, 75, 100 years ago, and they were wrong then. and you draw whatever inference you want from it.
Randall, I want to get your response, but
sorry.
before you begin, I always like to remind people, and Jeff has heard me say this before, when you look around this room, half the people in this room are going to live to be 100 years old. And the other half of you are going to live to be close to 100. I mean, think about the kinds of advances that we've seen in medical science. I mean, in the developed world, we have access to drugs to treat cholesterol, high blood pressure, HIV/AIDS products are advancing, oncology drugs are advancing, major organ transplants are routine now, hip and knee transplants, orthopedic procedures, minimally invasive surgery. We can even grow hair and have sex for the rest of our lives. So it's almost as if this is going to be the thing that I remember that I learned that was the most valuable lesson I learned when I was at Morehouse College was to continue to learn. This is just the beginning. So it's like, in a way, we're going to be lifetime learners. In formal institutions, with distance learning, with all of these other things. So just keep that in mind. Go ahead.
Well, my bachelor's degree is in biology. One of the premises that I was given my freshman year in biology, if you're not growing, you're dying. I mean, it's just the way biology works. It's the way life works. And I think the analogy is apt to education as well. We've got to keep learning all the time. Some of the discussion has to be, what do you mean? It starts to sound like Bill Clinton here. You know, what do you mean by college? Because I have a fundamentally different task in the education framework than Tim and his faculty have at Clayton State. There is a percentage of our population, self-servingly I say 10%. It's probably bigger than that. But there's a percentage at the top level who are going to be the leaders of this country, the leaders of the world, leaders of the state, and they absolutely need the 4-year and advanced degrees, all they can get, because the tasks that they're going to be asked to perform, the challenges they're going to have to solve, are going to require everything that they can get. Right. There's another percentage, and we've joked a little bit about the military, there's a percentage of that high school population that's not sure what they're going to do for the most part. They're going to go in the military. And they're going to spend some time figuring out what they want to do when they grow up, which, by the way, in the technical college, we think is a serious question. And then there's that middle group that probably doesn't want to go to the 4-year degree, probably doesn't want to be in the military, but in order to make informed decisions, in order to be citizens of that economic reality that Tim was talking about, they've got to have more than what we can give them in high school. Right. Because simply, by the time a student graduates from high school, there's just too much to be known to let that be all there is. It's just an issue of, what do you mean, where do I go? I think the best thing that we can do for our students from high school through the advanced degrees at the senior research institutions at the university system is to make it as seamless and as easy to transit as it can be made to be. Right. So that I reflect back in my master's degree where I forget the subject, I forget even the professor's name, but we were talking about students in school and in education and how we weren't getting the results that we wanted out of the school system. And the professor said, well, what do you expect from a system that's based on astrology? We said, what do you mean? I mean, we're all graduate students. We're all going up and smoke about school systems based on astrology. He says, well, astrology is making life decisions based on when and where you were born. And how do you get into school? Well, if your birthday is, before September, whatever, then you can be a first grader. And there are some kids, and I know Jeff will say, there are some kids who are 7 years old and shouldn't be in the first grade yet. There are some that are 4 and we're wasting their time. They should have already been there. And it's a matter of that individual capability and all those other kind of things. So what we've got to do as educators and as community citizens is to make the education system responsive to what the community and the economy need. And that does mean, Tim's right, I have students in our 2-year associate's degree level college that have 4-year degrees. Right. And they're back for different skill sets, for different purposes. They changed their mind. I don't want to do that anymore. I want to do this, but I have to have this skill set. And what we've got to do is make it as flexible, as easy to transition through as it can be, so that we can provide the skill sets at whatever level they may be, whether they're very simple or very complex.
Good dialogue and good responses. In the video that we just saw by Sir Ken Howard, he really talked about the fact that people sort of learn in different ways, and he alluded to the fact that we almost have to tailor the education to fit the individual, whereas before, we still in this country have a tendency to sort of block people by test scores, and we sort of teach to pass tests, and there are certain blocks and ways that people progress. So that, again, it's just a very interesting video and something to think about. But what I want to ask you all now, and Jeff, you really talked about this in the book that you sort of passed out to all of your principals, are these skill sets that students need, that citizens need, that people need today if they're going to be viable employers, viable citizens, if they're going to be actually effective as they're going into the workforce. And then, Ron, I want to get some of your perspective on what it is you're looking at as you're looking to develop people or hire people to work in the company that you lead.
I could go on for quite a long while about No Child Left Behind and the implications of that piece of legislation. But one thing I will say, with the increase in standardized testing, it really has forced school systems, teachers, principals to try to get kids prepared to pass a test. And again, we're trying to change the conversation in Fayette County. And so what we started last fall was having community conversations in all of our schools with a guiding question of what skills do we want our kids to have when they graduate from one of our high schools? What are those very important skills? And from there, we have 3 different advisory groups that I'm working with. We have a community advisory group, which is 1 parent from each of our schools. We have a teacher advisory group, which is the teacher of the year from each of our schools. And then I have a student advisory group, which is 4 high school students from each of our 5 county high schools. And we've been talking about that question the entire year. And we came up with a whole list of skills. And our challenge then was to narrow those down, to try to get it down to 4 or 5. And I'll share with you those skills that we've come up with are very similar to the skills Tony Wagner talks about in his book. And you can call them the 4 C's: critical thinking, creativity, communication, and collaboration. But what CEOs are telling us, they know the skills they need the workforce to have in order to be able to handle those emerging jobs. And it's those skills right there. So how do we transform our public education system to one that's been so focused on standardized test scores? And to be honest with you, those measure very low-level skills. Those are knowledge, comprehension, recall. Life is not a multiple choice test. Another favorite quote that I love to share with people. What we need to do is we need to make sure how we're assessing students aligns with the skills they need to be successful in the future. And a conversation that Tim and I had is the public school system has to have a conversation with post-secondary education and has to have a conversation with corporate America. We have got to be on the same page when it comes to what we need to do to educate our kids in the 21st century.
Thank you. Ron, I want to ask you something in particular. I remember when you and I started at TAP Pharmaceuticals, I was like the 50th employee hired, and in the 11 years I was there, we grew the company from 50 to about 3,000 people, from 100 million in sales to 2.5 billion. Every 6 months it seems like we were in newly created positions. As you're looking at the kinds of people that are being hired, I mean, in the pharmaceutical industry, how do you pick the best and the brightest? What kind of people are you looking for? And what kind of skills do you expect them to have?
So it's definitely been a very fluid industry. In the beginning, it was all about relationship with your doctors. If you have the right relationship with your doctors, you could get more prescriptions. Now there's a lot more factors that go into actually that doctor being able to write the prescription. Even though they may want to write your drug, it doesn't happen that way without some type of intervention from a managed care company or pharmacy benefit management. So the business has become a lot more complex. So the skill sets that we're looking for are people that can solve complex problems, which the 4 C's is perfect. Earlier we were talking about, do we need institutions? Well, that institution grounds you and it gives you a base. And from that base, you can apply that knowledge to other circumstances that you find yourself in. And so what we look for are people that have developed specific skill sets that are transferable. When we ask candidates question, we use what we call a STAR format. Or that's what we expect back in the response, because we want people to tell, okay, tell me about a specific situation, what were actions that you took, and then what were the results of your actions. And every employer, doesn't matter if it's pharmaceutical, doesn't matter if you're working for IBM, people are looking for people that can deliver results and can deliver results with not all the information, because information is moving so fast that you don't always have the time to collaborate with all the people that you probably should. And many times your corporation doesn't have the knowledge. Right. So you need to be able to navigate through. So people that can think, that is probably the biggest thing that we look for, is people that can think and then act. So the 4 C's are just, they're so spot on. And as I was coaching my daughter when she was going into the business world, I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about, well, why do you think that way? Why would someone hire you based off the way you think? And it was great because she just kept pulling from different professors in different schools that she was in different circumstances. So clearly it is a very important aspect to just the growth of a nation. And just one other thing I wanted to comment, you were talking about medicine, how it's changed, and how, you know, there was, I guess, at least when I was growing up, there was this technical school, and then there was, oh, you went to a undergraduate 4 years, so there was kind of this feeling of one was better than the other. But it's interesting, my wife works for Abbott Vascular, so they do a lot of interventions. And I actually went in and saw a couple procedures, and here's this gentleman, he was a Vietnam veteran, and so they're showing the x-ray, see all these black dots, big black dots. I'm like, what is that? They go, oh, that's shrapnel. And then behind the shrapnel, I see what looks like chicken wire just kind of wrapped all over. I'm like, what is that? Oh, he had open heart surgery about 12 years ago. And that's what's holding together. And then there's this little stent. It looks like a very small, remember Slinkies? So it's really small slinky that they put in to open up your arteries now. And that started in the mid-'80s. And you know, everyone thought that those folks were quacks when they started it. And now these things are saving people's lives. So now that gentleman doesn't have all that chicken wire around. And so the doctors that are learning these skills, as well as the staff, yes, they have their undergraduate degree, their master's, their degree in medicine. They're going to these technical schools to learn a very specific skill set. So at one time it was always high school, technical school, and I remember when we moved to Georgia, it was like, well, you can go down a couple paths. You can go down the technical school path, and we're going to, because we're not sure that you're smart enough to go to the other way. But when you actually get out into the business world, maybe you have a platform here, and then they send you to technical school.
One thing I want to just kind of add on that is I think the community has a responsibility for some of the education. Some of these skills that we're talking about, the 4 C's, you know, I think that's something that if people volunteered their time or dedicated some time, they can kind of pass that knowledge along, whether it's in a protege type program or a mentorship type thing. You know, schools can't do it all, especially as budgets get trimmed, as time gets condensed. You know, I think about, I've heard anecdotally that some of the school newspapers are in trouble. You know, they may not be there next year. They may not have the budget for it. They may not have the money to pay to print anymore. You know, so that's something that maybe, you know, my business can chip in and offer, you know, in that way. And I think if every business kind of looks in that.
And so there are still newspapers that are actually printed?
Every high school has one, yeah.
I thought that everything was on.
We have one 3 times a week.
You know, the
Go ahead, Randy.
the conversation about should people be going to college is not about institutions. It's about what should be what should people be learning. You're about to see probably the biggest paradigm shift since the 17th century in education. Right now at Southern Crescent, over 71% of all of our students take at least one online course. Some are digital students, and they're just online students. But MIT, in the last few weeks, they've never gone into online coursework much, but now they have a thing that they call MIT X. And rather than paying to go to the university, learning all this stuff and coming out with a degree, you can go online, take the class for free. Then if you can pass the test and you want the diploma, then you can pay them for it. And so, I mean, it's
for the last 10 years, MIT has put every one of its courses available free online. All right. So it's not that content is not available, but the folks who are at this table at various levels have to help navigate a new generation of students to make sense out of that content that's available. I want to go back to the video just for a second because it's consistent with this. The metaphor of the industrial model is something you want to hold on to, because if you're making stuff and your supply of raw materials are assumed to be substantial, in 19th and early 20th century, that was the case. If you had parts that didn't work, you threw them out, okay? And if you could get enough things to work, you could make a living with that. But in an information age, we cannot do that with our intellectual capital, right? We cannot afford to have students be sorted out. 50 years ago in Georgia, if a student was sorted out, he or she could make a good living in a mill. It was really hard work, but it was work, it was honest work, and it paid. But those parts of the industrial economy are no longer with us. And in the same way that we can no longer, in a time of scarce resources, throw out parts that don't work in a factory, neither can we create a condition to assume that it's all right for a substantial number of our kids to fail. And that's a straightforward implication of a movement from an industrial model to an information model in which failure for the vast majority of our population, not just our children, is not an option.
And he just boosted me to my soapbox, so I gotta say this.
It's my job here. You know?
He just put me on my soapbox. State of Georgia population around 9 million. There are about 1.3 million adults in the state of Georgia over the age of 18 who have no high school credential whatever. Talk about throwing folks away.
We don't have to talk about the state legislature now.
But I mean, we talk about
that was a bad joke.
Yeah, but if education were medicine, we go from the industrial analogy to the medical analogy. If education were medicine, that 1.3 million people would be in intensive care because they are not going to have the 21st century jobs. They are not going to even get the interviews. They won't pass a simple paper screening. Oh, well, you haven't been in school, so you know there's a real handicap, and that's a piece that the technical college system takes as a very serious part of what we do. We have 3 missions. We do credit instruction, we do economic development, but we do that adult literacy, GED preparation and testing piece also. And that's something that, like I said, that's my soapbox issue. I'll get off of it and let you guys go and talk about this. But we've got to capture that population back and get them back into the system somewhere.
Okay, you guys are going to think I'm all about initials, but I mentioned the 4 C's, and I also want to talk about 3 R's for a minute. I'm not talking about reading, writing, and arithmetic, which are still very, very important. But what Randy touched on is about relevance. And it's something we talk about in our school system all the time. In order to keep these kids in school and keep them engaged where they will graduate, we have to make learning relevant for our students. One of the things we're starting to do in Fayette County schools, we're piloting a program we called Bring Your Own Technology at Whitewater High School and Booth Middle School this semester. And the plan is to hopefully move into all middle schools and high schools next fall, and the elementary schools will be in the third phase. What I am seeing at Whitewater High School and Booth Middle School absolutely blows me away. I was at Booth Middle School today. Kids are very, very engaged because they're using devices that they're bringing from home. They're familiar with it. Now, were our teachers a little bit nervous about this pilot program? Yes, they were. But as I speak to teachers at Whitewater and Booth, what they're telling me is they are absolutely convinced this is the right way to go. And we are meeting kids on their turf. We're meeting kids at their comfort level. I had a French teacher at Whitewater High School who was very resistant to this, told me within 3 or 4 weeks she was absolutely convinced this was the right thing to do because her students are now coming up to her and say, hey, I found this application. You know, that assignment we were working on, we can go to this application. We can find the information we need. When I was in her classroom, they were on the metro in Paris going out to all these sites. Kids were using their own devices, and they were absolutely 100% engaged. Mr. Raybold, the principal at Whitewater High School, tells me discipline has gone down dramatically since we've allowed kids to bring their technology. And teachers are telling him anecdotally that kids are performing at a much higher level. That's meeting them on their turf, that's relevance, and that's what we're talking about. The other 2 R's, just so you know, is rigor, which when I say rigor, I'm talking about higher order thinking skills. And the final 3rd R, which is really the bedrock of who we are as a public school system, is relationships. We are a relationship business. We have to have great rapport with our students, with our parents, with our business community. A homeschool community relationship is the best way to provide the best possible public education for our children. And I really believe strongly in that 3rd R, which is relationships.
You know, it's really interesting, Jeff, that you mentioned that, that the teachers were a little nervous about the fact that you're instituting a change now. And even as you all talked about the fact that UMass, I mean MIT, places like MIT, Caltech, Stanford are beginning to put a lot of their courses online in the virtual world now. It's something because those are the institutions where the guts of the internet was basically invented. And yet, we all struggle with change. One of the other things that you mentioned, Tim, was the fact that we're really in a competitive global environment now. It's very disruptive. The economic shocks that are occurring in this country are reverberating around the world. I mean, all of this is connected now. And we're in a very diverse world now. It's globally diverse. When you think about your institutions, the Fayette County school system, the institutions of higher education, the company that you work for, a Japanese company, Ron. We're all sort of connected now around the world, and it's a very diverse world. There are probably multiple languages spoken within each of your institutions. We have diversity by, you know, the traditional ways that we think about diversity, race, gender, ethnicity, but there are also these other dimensions, thinking, class, gender. And again, I have to say this, women are over-indexing now in most graduate schools, MBA programs, medical school, law school. Women are going to be the largest entrants to the global workforce as we move forward. So as you think about all of these diversity dimensions that we're dealing with, how important is it that we become more facile, I guess, in what I call managing diversity or leveraging diversity across a number of dimensions, and how are you all looking at that in your institutions?
I had the opportunity about 10 days ago to visit one of our adult literacy classes in Peachtree City. Mm-hmm. It was an English as a second language, or English for speakers of other languages class. People from 17 countries, all of them who live, people from 17 countries in that classroom, all of them who live here in Fayette County. In fact, most of them live in Peachtree City. I mean, it's a fact of life, and if we can't communicate, if diversity is not something that we embrace, then we are surely left behind. There's just no question about it.
So Julie said we worked together at TAP. TAP was, our father was Mr. Takeda and our mother was Miss Abbott. So we had 2 parents, and eventually they got divorced, and so now I work for Takeda. But when I was with Julius at TAP, our vice president of sale at the time tapped Julius on the shoulder and asked him to start up a diversity advisory council initiative, because he recognized that, you know, this is a global company that we're working for, and our customers are diverse, our patients are diverse, and so he wanted to make sure that our company was diverse. And so initially, when we were going through these early phases, our mentality of diversity was, you know, race, gender, sexual orientation, religions, and what it quickly morphed to was diversity in thought, you know. Because if you sit down with a group of people that all think the same way, don't plan on advancing anything.
Right.
One of the, or staying in existence, one of the consultants that we work with was Dr. Roosevelt Thomas, who's based out of Atlanta, and one of the books that he wrote, one of the many books that he wrote, he used an example of Phil Jackson, who was coaching the Chicago Bulls. So now you have Michael Jordan, the greatest basketball player, and then you have this need. We need rebounders. So that you bring in Dennis Rodman, probably the most eclectic basketball player, who has been known to wear wedding dresses and dye his hair pink. And so Michael Jordan, a very conservative, the Bulls, a very conservative program. Now they have to be able to accept Dennis Rodman. And what Phil Jackson did better than anybody else, he said, Michael, we need rebounders, right? That's the best rebounder in the game. Let him do his job. At 5 o'clock when the day's done, you don't have to go home with them, and you don't have to hang out with them. And so he was able to take this very diverse team of unique individuals, Scottie Pippen wanting to be Michael Jordan, right?
Yes.
And form a team that won 6 championships. So it wasn't just diversity in how they look, but it was diversity in thought, it's diversity in the way they handled themselves. And that's one of the things that we really gravitated as a company. And so we were one of these subsidiaries of Abbott, and Abbott quickly, they kept coming to our diversity meetings and then kept stealing our ideas, which was great. And then Abbott now is known as one of the most respected companies in terms of women in business, diversity in the workforce, diversity in the type of products that they have. So it's really cool how what you start off with is something that, oh, this is a black and white issue, and it ends up really being, wow, this is a makes good sense issue, and this is how we can advance the whole organization.
And the fact that you used the term requirement meant that, like the others of us, we were our students of Roosevelt Thomas. And the whole notion of management of diversity is an examination of the frictions that inevitably come with systems of similarities and differences, and the ability to move past what appear to be obvious differences, and to manage that in ways in which the similarities amongst people are not lost sight of. And so there were enormous differences amongst some very powerful egos on the Bulls, but the similarities were the shared commitment to victory. More victories than anybody else, which is painful for a Celtics fan. So Jackson's real skill as a leader was to make certain that he understood and communicated the requirements, focused on shared similarities, while acknowledging that in certain ways diversities either were not going to be overcome, but in solving many issues was not important.